So I wanted to talk a little bit about book cover design. And book cover design is a really interesting design project because usually you're designing with both type and visuals, and you have to sort of create an interpretation of the book without giving away the secret of the book. So you're going to choose type or visuals based on the feeling or style. And for example, a sans serif thick type might be chosen if you want really a strong, bold feeling. If you want more of a soft feeling, maybe a serif type. And those text and graphics or photographs really need to complement each other. And every piece of type and image has to be there for a reason. Chip Kidd was a master at book cover design. He's designed, I don't even know how many covers since he's been designing since 1986. And I'm sure he's designed over 100 book covers. And he's now art director for Knopfton Random House. And his designs are always really well thought out and planned. And he treats each assignment as a problem that he has to really solve before he even starts his design process. This is a quote from him. Take a good long look at what's been done in the past and use it to inform how you move forward. So you can kind of see how he's thinking about the story, the genre. He's thinking about how to integrate front, back, and spine. And he wants to captivate and really excite and make people want to read the book. Sometimes he pulls something from the story and sort of uses that as a visual metaphor. In this design, Haruki Murakami, he did this amazing, transparent, soft cover that he put on top. So that as you kind of peeled it away, there were various meanings. And so it's almost like you're unwrapping it and figuring things out with the unwrapping. And so he did this really interesting thing with the design and transparency on this transparent cover that he used over the hardback book. He also designed for Jurassic Park, and he did the iconic positive negative graphics of the dinosaurs. Very simple, just using sort of positive negative space, but very powerful. These are some of his designs. I'm going to go into one of his more comic book, pop culture graphical novels. And so these pop culture graphical novels, comic books had a huge impact on his visual style. And he's very prolific. I mean, he's worked with so many notable authors, including Frank Miller, Dean Koontz, John Updike. So book cover is something the reader, sometimes it's the first experience with the book, and it often sells the book. It has to arouse interest. One thing to ask yourself is, what visual would capture the book's essence, plot, character, storyline? So before you design a book cover, you really have to read the book and you have to think about essence, plot, character, storyline. And often a reader will contemplate the cover while reading. It becomes part of sort of the whole reading experience. And when, book covers are in a bookstore, for example, they're placed next to a lot of different types of books. So yours sort of has to stand out. It has to intrigue, and it has to make people interested. And so it's one of those design projects where the visual impact is hugely important. Often you'll see with book cover designs that there's a subtlety to the images in terms of their color scheme, but there's a really sort of dynamic energetic composition. So you want to keep potentially the colors sort of subtle, but the composition really strong. And the reason the colors should maybe be subtle is because, as we know, as we've kind of gone through the course, we've learned about color, and we know that color can be really overpowering. So sometimes it's appropriate to have like a really visually chaotic color scheme, but often that can sort of detract and make it confusing, make the design confusing. So for example, in this photograph, it's been desaturated, and then there's this really beautiful thing happening with transparency, and the only color is in the type. There's also text-driven designs, and those can be because you have a limited budget and you don't have, or there's just not appropriate imagery, and you really want to create a typographic solution with the words that are going to create the most visual or emotional impact. And often a typographic design includes text that really is geared towards a specific audience that's going to be captivated or intrigued. So Obama, for example, is a word that if somebody sees that word, they might automatically go up to the book and look at it because they want to know more about Obama, they want to learn about Obama, or they're interested in Obama. And you're always thinking about this visual hierarchy, whether you're using graphics, photographs, or just text. That visual hierarchy is really critical. What does the audience need to read first, second, or third? So this was kind of done in an interesting way where there were specific words faster here, where they created this sort of black box, black rectangular shape to frame it in. And that sort of makes it sort of a focal point, makes us look at it. And then if you are using type and image, you really want synergy between the type and image. You want to think about the colors, how the colors complement each other. If there are a lot of colors in the image, you want to really make sure it's balanced and that the type is really complementing that. And then you're also thinking about the visual star. I know you've read about this, but who is the visual star in the design? Do you want the type to be the visual star? Do you want the image to be the visual star? What's going to really make people look first and then sort of explore? This was a hybrid image and graphic put together. So you can see that there's this little illustration of the planets. And it's Feynman's Lost Lecture, and it's the motion of the planets around the sun. So there's this beautiful photograph. You can see it's desaturated, and then there's a little bit of color in the text that sort of complements the photograph. And then you have this really cool illustration to sort of show the planetary system here. This is image-driven design, where the text is strategically placed so that you read it, but what's going to captivate us and make us interested and excited about the book is definitely the image. Front, back, and spine. So you're thinking about the three sides, and all three sides sort of need to stand on their own, but they also have to work as a whole package. So when you design the book, you want to lay it out so that you're designing all three sides simultaneously, and then keeping sort of this this idea that the reader might experience each side separately, but they also have to go together. They have to pull us in and be visually continuous. Front, back, and spine for JFK. So you can see that the strategy here was to sort of base the design on the American flag. They were using sort of a typewriter font. This book was about Artie Lange, and the best way to communicate who Artie Lange is to show a photograph of him, because he's such a character. He's a comedian. He was on the Howard Stern radio show for many years. He's scrappy. He's profane. And so this photograph really worked to sort of communicate who he is as a personality. And then that sort of grunge-style font on top worked well. This, on the other hand, was little pinpricks to create those letter shapes, little pinpricks over and over again. So if you ran your finger over it, you'd feel the little pricks. And it's that obsession that we're trying to communicate, that sort of idea that someone would do this, that they would create this type with these little pinpricks is very obsessive. And so it's kind of going into the storyline about obsession. This was a book called The Hidden Curriculum, and it's about campus conflict, student anxiety, and sort of how it thwarts the student's ability to develop independently or think creatively. And so The Hidden Curriculum is a typographic solution, but it's kind of broken apart. So it makes you look, it makes you want to read it. And then, of course, they put it sort of down here so that it could really be read. But up here, it's sort of a puzzle you want to solve. It sort of makes you agitated as you look at it, which is part of the strategy. And you can see the visual hierarchy. And this was just done with simple iconography. This was a book called 1717, and it's fractured culture, fractured family life in the hills above LA. And so you can see how they really did this cool photo grid where they cut a photograph up and then sort of used these grid lines and replaced it back together, duplicating some of the imagery to create that sort of tension. This was a book about adventures in winemaking, and what better way to communicate that than with stains of wine. And also this is sort of creating the shape of the grapes. This was called Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And so to show this mechanical reproduction was the strategy, kind of a clever trick to make people look. I like this one because of the typography. It's a really beautiful typographic design where there's lots of thought going into what type would best communicate the message. And there's sort of a combination of fonts here. And then there's also this really beautiful, subtle, transparent photograph in the background of the family sort of drawing us in, but it's almost secondary. It doesn't capture me right away. I look at the text first, and then I'm sort of captivated by that image in the background. Very balanced and creating this really sense of visual unity. Okay, I'm just going to go through a few colors. Now, this is an example of two different designs communicating a book differently. So it's a different interpretation. So this was the book Intensity, and it's about this woman, and she's in Napa, and she's sort of trapped, and it's a fight for survival. It's a homicidal adventure. And so you can see two different sort of design strategies for it. One makes you feel this one I think makes me feel almost the chaos of it all. And the second design makes me feel sort of the horror, the fear, what's going to happen. So it's really communicating two different concepts. This is kind of a cool idea. This was a novel where the protagonist sort of smokes this specific brand of cigarettes, and the designer thought it would be kind of interesting to recreate the pack. And the pack didn't exist in the real world. It was a made-up brand, and so the designer kind of imagined what the brand would look like. Sort of an interesting way to approach the typography here. This was a relentless spoof of Cable's home shopping mania, and you can almost see that agitation. It's making me feel that chaos, that mania that happens on Cable shopping. This was a collection of poetry, and you can see that there's two really different images being used. The first is sort of a Renaissance fresco, and then the second is sort of an old newspaper photograph of these soldiers. And then it's connected with this little strip. It's almost like a little strip of paper with poems in the middle. White Like Me, the designer felt like what better way to agitate and make people think than to split the face and not allow people to see the expression, only the features of the hair and the chin. So sometimes this creative use of photography can sort of disrupt and make us sort of anxious, make us want to know more, captivated. This was a novel, and it was set in the late 19th century, and it's sort of about this spiritualist movement and the Civil War, and there's this idea that this person is being haunted by the past. And I love these little illustrations on the corners paired with the photograph. This jacket is printed on 2 layers, and it's to reflect the main theme of the novel, which is concealment. And so there's this semi-transparent stripe of white offset that offsets the red jacket and discloses the book's title underneath. This is a story of a 20-something man's trip through love and relationships, and it's actual game pieces. So these were models that were photographed and then turned into game pieces. And then you can see how this is meant to look like a game up here. This was a book of short stories. Each of these collaged images sort of represents one of the book's stories. And the illustration is sort of a traditional collage, and it's manipulated in Photoshop as well. So it's sort of traditional collage and then digital collage. This was about a young woman activist in the Soviet Union who is forced into internal exile, and she wanted it to look like the book cover is meant to feel like a collage, as if it's put together by hand on these scraps of paper that were written while in jail. Because one of the ideas is the author wrote this book from notes on scraps of paper while she was in jail. This was a novel in the 1970s where there's this suburb, and it's in Connecticut, and there's this really intense freak winter storm, and the keys, these were photographed by putting keys into a block of ice, and the ice is sort of the literal ice storm where the photographs, the keys are sort of representing the key party that happens in the suburban neighborhood. So it's sort of bringing in the two ideas of what's happening, the storm and the key party. Paperboy, this is a 1940s copy of the New York Times, and the idea is to make the book look deliverable like a newspaper. John Updike, this was a painting found at sort of an old flea market, and you can see it's a close-up, and there's this texture of the face. And this was a really simple design. You see it's just sort of positive, negative shapes. And the idea is to make you think about what these circles represent. Are they groups of people, or are they the virus itself? So what are these clumps? This was sort of a combination of this really beautiful woodcut illustration. And then if you've noticed down here, there's this old black and white photograph, and the book's about a love story between this girl and a soldier during World War I. So powerful imagery, that can be really something that makes a viewer want to read it, that gives us sort of insight into what the story's about. And metaphors. So this book, The Honeymoon's Over, what better way to sort of describe that, make us think about that, than a piece of burnt toast, which was a metaphor for the idea that the marriage is done. So series are something that you need to consider when you design a book. If there is a second book or a third book being planned, you might design all three, and usually there is this intent to design all three. You need to make each one look unique, but then also have sort of a visual continuity between each design. Sometimes it's really simple and just sort of a little bit of color shift, a little bit of textural shift. Other times you really have to think strategically. For example, in this series, these are three very different types of novels, but they required sort of a loose format to hold them together. And so there are these graphical elements. They're really different graphical elements, but you can see the way they're designed and the way the text is laid out, and those three rectangular shapes sort of placed in that grid on each of the front covers creates that visual unity. So yeah, sometimes it can be, you can really do interesting things on each of the covers, but then you want to connect, and how can you connect? Maybe it's as simple as the placement of the title and the text is all in the same format, and that creates the connection. So think about, as you design book covers, think about how the readers respond. They usually shop with their eyes, they look for familiarity, but they really want surprise. Think about the author and the brand, the genre. Other things you might want to think about is it going to be printed? Is it an ebook, or both? What's the format? Is it paperback, hardback, case-bound? Does it have a dust jacket? Is there a specific size that you need to make a book? Because a 300-page book will get extremely thick if it's designed too small, while a larger book needs to be a good length to not feel flimsy and more like a magazine or a booklet. So a lot of things. Understand the elements of the cover. Really read the book, assess the book, think of the plot, the storyline, the feel of the book. And that's always really important before you start the design process. You have to really understand that book as if you were the author yourself, before you can sort of strategize about what the design is going to be.